What is happening to my high school bully? One day, this random freshman tripped in the hallway and dropped all his books, and Jackson kneeled down to help pick them up. Everyone immediately turned to stare at him, because this was the same Jackson who broke my friend's phone for fun and made a girl transfer schools from harassment. And now he was kneeling on the dirty floor, carefully collecting paper. When he gave them back, he actually apologized for things he'd done to the kid last semester. That same day, we found him sitting with the special education kids at lunch, not mocking them, but actually listening to their stories and laughing at their jokes. When one of them spilled milk all over Jackson's shoes, Jackson was the one to clean it up himself. The kid looked terrified at first, waiting for Jackson to hurt him, but Jackson just smiled and said accidents happen. He began tutoring kids in math for free, using the same brain he'd used to figure out people's weaknesses to help freshmen understand algebra. He stayed after school for 3 hours working with this kid who he'd shoved into lockers all last year. The kid kept flinching every time Jackson moved too fast, but Jackson just kept explaining problems in this patient voice I'd never heard from him. He even donated $500 to the fundraiser for the kid whose dad had cancer, saying he'd been saving it for a new car, but this was more important. The guy who'd made my sophomore year hell was suddenly Mother Teresa reborn, and I didn't trust it. So I kept watching him, and that's when I noticed something. His hands shook when he helped people. He kept looking over his shoulder like something bad could happen at any moment. He started leaving notes in people's lockers, long apologies that went into specific detail about every cruel thing he'd done. He gave away his championship ring, his leather jacket, even his car. Then one day Jackson showed up with a black eye he'd tried to cover with concealer. When his coach asked what happened, he said he walked into a door. But during lunch I saw him writing frantically into a journal, and he kept checking his phone, his face going white every time it buzzed. After school I found him in the bathroom crying so hard he couldn't breathe. When he saw me, he grabbed my shoulders and said he was sorry for everything, that he'd been a monster, and that he was trying to be better before it was too late. When I asked what he meant by too late, he just shook his head and begged me to forgive him. He actually got on his knees and begged. Jackson started giving away more things, sentimental photos from his wallet, his late grandfather's watch, a necklace his little sister handmade him. He told people to remember the good version of him, not the monster he used to be. He took his journal to the principal and made her promise not to open it until he gave her permission. His friends said he'd been talking like he was running out of time. The bruises kept getting worse, and Jackson kept making up worse lies about where they came from. He started staying at school as late as possible, sitting in class like he was afraid to go somewhere. Jackson began telling people he loved them, just randomly saying it to kids he barely knew. He hugged everyone, even people who were terrified of him. These desperate hugs like he was trying to memorize what human contact felt like. He started asking weird questions about forgiveness, if people could really change. His phone would ring during class and he'd look at it and his whole body would go rigid. Teachers would tell him to put it away, but he couldn't. He started missing first period, showing up looking like he'd been crying, but wouldn't tell anyone where he'd been. One morning, Jackson pulled me aside and said everything he'd been doing, all the good things, weren't really his choice. He said he'd been given exactly 30 days to make amends for everything he'd ever done wrong, and today was day 30. When I asked what would happen after 30 days, he just said some people don't get second chances, they just get deadlines. I started following him because something felt really wrong, and I watched him go to every single person he'd ever hurt and whisper something to them. Whatever he said made them look confused and scared, but he wouldn't explain, just moved on to the next person like he was checking names off a list. By lunch, he'd talk to everyone except me. After school, I found Jackson on the roof looking down at the parking lot. He turned to me with tears streaming down his face and said it was 3 o'clock, that he'd tried to fix everything, but some things can't be undone. His phone started ringing and he looked at it with pure terror. "They're here," he whispered, backing toward the edge. "They said if I finished the list, they'd let me choose how it happens." "Choose how what happens?" I asked. But Jackson was already looking past me at someone standing in the doorway behind me. I turned around, but no one was there, and when I turned back, Jackson was gone. My legs won't move at first. I just stand there staring at the empty space where Jackson was 3 seconds ago. My brain keeps trying to make sense of it, but there's nothing to make sense of. Then something clicks and I'm running toward the stairwell door, yanking it open so hard it bangs against the wall. I take the stairs 2 at a time, checking every landing as I go down. The second floor landing is empty. The first floor landing has some papers scattered around, but no Jackson. The ground floor has a janitor's cart, but still no Jackson. I push through the door into the main hallway and nearly crash into a group of freshmen. They scatter and I scan the hallway in both directions. That's when I see him. Jackson is pushing through the side exit doors near the gym. His hood is pulled up and his phone is pressed against his ear. He's not running, but he's moving with purpose, like someone told him exactly where to go. I start moving toward him, but he's already outside. The doors swing shut behind him. I could follow him, but something stops me. Every instinct I have says don't get adults involved. Don't be a snitch. Handle it yourself. But this isn't about getting someone in trouble for skipping class. Jackson looked ready to jump off that roof. He said people were here. He said they were letting him choose how it happens. I turn around and head toward the main office instead. Mrs. Chandler's light is still on, even though it's after 3. I can see her through the glass window sitting at her desk doing paperwork. I push open the door, and she looks up with that annoyed expression principals get when students interrupt them. I try to explain what just happened on the roof, but the words come out jumbled. Mrs. Chandler's expression changes fast. The annoyance disappears and something else takes its place. Alarm, maybe. She stands up and asks me to repeat what Jackson said. I tell her about the phone call and the terror in his eyes and how he kept saying they were here. She picks up her phone and calls someone, asking them to come to her office right away. 2 minutes later, Rod Wiley walks in. He's the school resource officer, and he always wears his uniform, even though everyone knows he's basically a cop. Mr. Chandler tells him I just came from the roof where I found Jackson acting strange. Rod sits down across from me and pulls out a notebook. He asks what time I found Jackson. I say around 3 o'clock. He asks what Jackson said exactly. I repeat the conversation as best I can remember. Rod writes everything down and asks if I saw anyone else on the roof or in the stairwell. I shake my head. He asks if Jackson mentioned any names. I tell him Jackson just said they were here and they said he could choose how it happens. Rod closes his notebook and moves to Missy Chandler's computer. He clicks through a few screens until he gets to the security camera system. He pulls up the roof camera first, but the angle doesn't show where Jackson was standing. Then he switches to the hallway cameras. We watch the timestamp roll forward until we see Jackson pushing through the exit doors at exactly 3:01 p.m. Rod rewinds it and we watch again. Jackson keeps checking his phone every few seconds. His shoulders are hunched forward, and his head keeps turning like he's watching for something. He looks like someone following directions from whoever's on that phone. Rod picks up Missy Chandler's desk phone and makes a call. He uses words like safety protocols and emergency contact information. Missy Chandler nods and says she agrees they need to act. She mentions Jackson's behavior over the past month has been really concerning. She says she's been meaning to reach out to his parents, but kept hoping he'd come talk to her first. Rod hangs up and tells me he needs me to write down everything Jackson said while it's still fresh. Mr. Chandler hands me a piece of paper and a pen. I start writing, but my hands are shaking so bad the words look messy. I write about Jackson backing toward the edge. I write about him saying he tried to fix everything. Then I get to the part where he said they told him he could choose how it happens if he finished the list. Seeing those words on paper makes my stomach hurt. It sounds even worse written down than it did hearing Jackson say it. The door opens and a woman walks in. She's younger than Miss Chandler, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. Missy Chandler introduces her as Hallie Reed, the school counselor. Rod explains the situation quickly, and Hallie's face gets serious. She asks me to tell her what happened. I go through it again, and when I mention Jackson crying on the roof, Hallie nods like she expected that. She says Jackson has been coming to her office for the past few weeks. She noticed him crying during lunch periods and asked if he wanted to talk. He came a few times, but never really opened up about what was wrong. He kept giving vague answers about family stuff and school stress. Hallie pulls up a chair and sits down. She explains that Jackson's behavior matches patterns she's seen before with students in crisis. The giving away possessions thing is a major red flag. Making amends with everyone is another one. Talking about running out of time is a third. She doesn't say the word suicide, but I can tell that's what she's thinking. My hands won't stop shaking. Rod pulls out his phone and dials a number from the emergency contact sheet Missy Chandler handed him. He puts it on speaker, and we all listen to it ring 4 times before going to voicemail. The automated voice says the person at this number is not available, and to leave a message. Rod hangs up without leaving one and tries again. Same result. He marks something in his notebook and nods at Miss Chandler. She picks up her desk phone and dials another number, waiting while it rings. Her face gets more tight with each ring. Finally, she gets voicemail too and leaves a message saying, "This is Principal Chandler calling about an urgent matter concerning Jackson and to please call back right away." She hangs up and tells Rod that Jackson's parents are hard to reach during work hours. Rod asks if that's normal and Mr. Chandler nods, saying she's left messages before that took days to get returned. I remember something and sit up straighter. The journal Jackson gave Miss Chandler weeks ago, the one he made her promise not to open. I tell them about it, and both Hallie and Rod turn to look at Miss Chandler. She stares back at them for a long moment, then reaches down and unlocks her bottom desk drawer. She pulls out a thick spiral notebook with a black cover. The edges of the pages look worn like Jackson had been flipping through it constantly. Miss Chandler sets it on her desk but doesn't open it. Her hand rests on top of it like she's protecting it. Hallie leans forward and speaks in that calm counselor voice. She says if Jackson is in immediate danger, the journal might have information about where he went or who he's with. Miss Chandler's fingers tap on the notebook cover. She says Jackson trusted her enough to give this to her, and she promised not to read it without permission. Rod points out that Jackson also said something about people being here and having to choose, which sounds like coercion or threat. Before Miss Chandler can respond, my phone buzzes in my pocket. I pull it out and see a text from a number I don't recognize. The message just says, "He's making things right, don't ruin it." My stomach drops. I hold the phone out to Rod and he takes it from me, reading the message twice. His jaw gets tight and he tells me not to respond and not to delete anything. He pulls out his own phone and takes a picture of my screen, then opens a notes app and starts typing. He's making a log of when the message came in and what it said. Hallie asks who else knows I'm here right now, and I tell her nobody. I didn't tell anyone where I was going when I ran down from the roof. Rod says someone is watching closely enough to know I reported this within 20 minutes of it happening. That makes everyone in the room go quiet. There's a knock on the door and we all jump. Mrs. Chandler calls out to come in. Kira Hayes pushes the door open. She looks scared, her face pale and her hands shaking. Mrs. Chandler waves her inside and asks what's wrong. Kira says she needs to talk to someone about Jackson right now. She walks in and closes the door behind her. Rod introduces himself and asks Kira to explain what happened. Kira says Jackson found her this morning before first period. He gave her something and told her not to come looking for him today. She reaches into her jacket pocket and pulls out a silver watch. The metal is old and scratched, but you can tell it used to be nice. Kira holds it out and says this was Jackson's grandfather's watch. He showed it to everyone last year when his grandfather died. He wore it every day and wouldn't let anyone touch it. Kira's voice shakes as she explains that Jackson pressed it into her hands this morning and wouldn't let her give it back. He kept saying she should have it, that she should remember the good version of him. That freaked her out enough to finally come tell an adult. Hallie asks if Jackson said anything specific about today, or what would happen after school. Kira thinks for a second, then says Jackson mentioned something about finishing tasks. He said after 3 o'clock he'd finally be free. She didn't understand what he meant at the time, but it scared her. Rod writes everything down in his notebook. He asks if anyone else got gifts or warnings like this. Kira nods and says Jackson spent all of lunch going to specific people one by one. She noticed because she was sitting at a table where she could see most of the cafeteria. Jackson had his phone out and kept checking something on it, then going to the next person. He looked scared the whole time, like someone was making him do it. She watched him check off names on a list after talking to each person. Another knock on the door makes us all turn. Mrs. Chandler looks tired as she calls out to come in again. Caden Harrell walks in. He writes for the school paper and always has his phone out looking for stories. He glances around at all of us and asks if the rumors about Jackson are true. Rod sits up straighter and asks what rumors. Caden pulls out his phone and opens an app I don't recognize. He scrolls through messages and turns the screen toward Rod. There's a thread with dozens of messages about something called Project 30. Caden says students have been talking about this for weeks on the anonymous messaging app. Most people thought it was some weird art project or game. But now with Jackson missing, people are connecting it to him. Caden scrolls back through the thread showing posts that started exactly 1 month ago. The first message said something about making things right and having 30 days to fix past mistakes. Most kids thought it was some art project or one of those online mystery games where you solve puzzles. But now the dates line up perfectly with when Jackson started acting different. Caden keeps scrolling and shows us posts that count down the days, each one getting more intense about finishing tasks and proving change is real. Rod leans over Caden's shoulder and starts taking screenshots of every single post. His face gets harder with each image he captures. Chandler stands up and walks around her desk to see better, and I watch her expression shift from confused to really worried. The thread talks about something called the ledger, like a person keeping score of everything. One post says the ledger is always watching to make sure tasks get done right. Another post warns that skipping steps or faking progress has consequences. Hallie asks to see the phone and Caden hands it over. She reads through several posts and her jaw gets tight. She mentions that there have been online challenges before that trick teenagers into doing dangerous stuff. She talks about cases where kids got talked into hurting themselves through lists of tasks that got worse and worse. The room goes completely quiet. Everyone just stands there processing what this means. Jackson might be caught in something like that, something designed to manipulate kids who feel guilty or ashamed. My phone buzzes in my pocket, and everyone's eyes snap to me. I pull it out and see another message from the unknown number. This time it shows a countdown timer set for midnight with just 2 words underneath. Level 3 parking. My hands shake as I hold up the screen for Rod to see. He immediately grabs his own phone and starts trying to trace where the message came from. He tells me to keep my phone on and make sure it stays charged because we might need it. Chandler walks back to her desk and opens the bottom drawer. She pulls out Jackson's journal, the thick spiral notebook he gave her weeks ago. Hallie moves to stand next to her as a witness. Chandler's hands pause on the cover for a second before she opens it. The first page has a title written in careful handwriting. 30 harms, 30 amends. Below that is a numbered list going from 1 to 30. Each entry describes something terrible Jackson did to someone. The details are specific with dates and locations and exact descriptions of what happened. It's clear he's been keeping really careful records of every bad thing he ever did. Chandler starts flipping through the pages slowly. Next to each harm is a matching amend with a little check mark showing he finished it. The handwriting stays neat and controlled for the first few pages. But as Chandler keeps turning pages, the writing gets shakier and harder to read. Some pages have spots where the ink is blurred and smeared, tear stains. Jackson was crying while he wrote this stuff. Hallie points to an entry about halfway through the journal. The date shows it was written 2 weeks ago. Jackson writes about getting threats against his younger sister. Someone sent him photos of his house from different angles, photos of his sister's school, Pictures showing the routes his family takes every day. The entry describes how scared he felt seeing those images. How he knew he had to finish all 30 amends or something bad would happen to her. Further into the journal, Jackson writes the name Project 30 in capital letters. He mentions someone called Ledger who checks in with him every single day. Ledger makes sure Jackson completes each task exactly right. Jackson writes about feeling watched all the time, about his phone being monitored so Ledger always knows where he is and what he's doing. There's an entry about bruises from what Jackson calls motivation sessions, times when he tried to refuse or slow down and got hurt for it. Rod pulls out his phone again and calls someone from the district police department. He explains that we have evidence of online pressure and blackmail against a minor. His voice is calm, but firm as he describes what we found. While Rod talks on the phone, Caden opens a browser on his phone and starts searching. He types in Ledger and the school name looking for any connection. He finds old forum posts about a hazing scandal from 5 years ago. Students talking about brutal initiation rituals that went too far. Caden clicks on a link and pulls up a news article. He turns the screen toward us, showing a story about an alumni named Nicodemus Blair. Blair got accused of organizing really bad hazing activities, but never faced any charges. The school settled everything quietly and made it go away. Several students mentioned in the article talked about being forced to complete what they called redemption tasks after the incident. The article doesn't give many details, but the connection to what's happening now seems obvious. Rod pulls up the police database on Chandler's computer and types in Nicodemus Blair's name. The search loads and shows a complaint filed 6 years ago for assault. Rod clicks through the report and reads out loud that 3 students accused Blair of physical violence during hazing activities, but the complaint got dismissed after the school reached a settlement with all families involved. The notes section shows Blair gave a statement claiming the victims ruined his reputation by reporting him and that he would make sure bullies learned what real consequences felt like. Rod screenshots everything and forwards it to his department email, while Caden keeps searching for more connections. My phone buzzes in my pocket, and I pull it out to see another message from the unknown number. This time it's a link with text that says, Final Task Mercy at 3. I click the link and it opens a streaming page with a countdown timer showing 2 hours and 17 minutes remaining. The page title reads, Final Task Mercy at 3, and below that is a live video feed showing an empty parking garage level. Comments are disabled, but the view counter in the corner shows 47 people currently watching. I turn my phone toward Rod and he grabs it immediately to examine the stream. Chandler leans over his shoulder and her face goes pale when she sees the viewer count. Hallie asks what it means that 47 people are watching, and Rod explains this isn't just about Jackson anymore. Someone has turned this into a public spectacle with an audience. He pulls out his own phone and starts making calls while keeping my phone open to monitor the stream. Rod gets through to someone at the district superintendent's office and explains the situation in clipped professional language. He describes a minor being coerced toward potential self-harm with evidence of online manipulation and a live audience watching. The person on the other end must ask for more details because Rod starts listing everything we found in Jackson's journal, the threats against his sister, the countdown timer, and the streaming page with viewers. He requests immediate authorization for emergency intervention and coordinates with police command to establish response protocols. Chandler stands next to him, providing additional context about Jackson's behavior at the school and the sealed journal she received. The call lasts 8 minutes, and when Rod hangs up, he tells us authorization came through, and they're taking this seriously enough to mobilize multiple units. Hallie asks what happens next, and Rod explains they need to locate Jackson before the countdown ends, while also identifying who's controlling the stream. Kira, who has been quiet this whole time, suddenly speaks up and says she should try calling Jackson since he trusted her enough to give her his grandfather's watch and warn her not to look for him today. Rod considers this and nods, but Hallie immediately steps in to coach Kira on what to say. Hallie pulls Kira aside to a corner of the office and speaks in a low, calm voice about crisis intervention techniques. She explains that Kira should focus on keeping Jackson talking and avoid any language that sounds like judgment or pressure. Hallie emphasizes that people in crisis need to hear someone cares whether they live, not lectures about making good choices or demands to explain themselves. Kira listens carefully and takes out her phone with shaking hands. She pulls up Jackson's number and takes a deep breath before hitting call. The phone rings 4 times and goes to voicemail. Kira looks at Hallie, who nods encouragingly and mouths try again. Kira calls a second time, and on the 3rd ring, Jackson picks up. His voice comes through whispered and strained, saying he can't talk because they're watching. Kira asks who is watching, and there's a long pause where we can hear Jackson breathing heavily. He finally says, "I'm sorry," in a broken voice, and the line goes dead. Kira stares at her phone and reports that at least we know he's still alive and has his phone on him. Rod makes a note of the exact time of the call and adds it to his incident log. The main office door opens and 2 officers in plain clothes arrive carrying equipment cases. Rod introduces them as the cyber unit, and they immediately set up laptops on Chandler's desk. One of them takes my phone and connects it to their system to trace the streaming page. They work in silence, typing rapidly, and pulling up screens full of code and network information. After about 6 minutes, one of them announces the stream is hosted through public Wi-Fi at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the downtown parking garage. Rod immediately radios officers to check that location while the cyber unit continues tracing the signal source. The other tech pulls up building schematics for the parking garage and marks potential locations where someone could set up streaming equipment. Rod coordinates with responding units over his radio, giving specific instructions about approaching quietly without alerting whoever is running the operation. Chandler asks if we should evacuate the garage, and Rod says not yet, because that might spook the handler into doing something drastic. The stream continues showing the empty garage level with the countdown timer ticking down. Hallie catches my eye and gestures for me to follow her into the hallway outside the office. Once we're alone, she explains that if I get a chance to talk to Jackson, I should focus on keeping him alive rather than trying to solve everything. She emphasizes this point by saying, people in crisis need to hear that someone cares whether they live, not lectures about making good choices. Hallie teaches me specific phrases to use like, I want you to stay alive and I care what happens to you instead of everything will be okay, or you're making a mistake. She explains that crisis intervention is about buying time and maintaining connection, not fixing the underlying problems in one conversation. I practice saying the phrases out loud, and Hallie corrects my tone when I sound too urgent or demanding. She reminds me to speak slowly and calmly, no matter how scared I feel, because panic is contagious in crisis situations. We go back inside after about 5 minutes, and I feel slightly more prepared, though my hands are still shaking. Caden has his laptop open and is scrolling through the anonymous messaging app where the Project 30 thread originated. He clicks into his direct messages and finds something that makes him freeze. He calls Rod over and shows him a conversation from 2 weeks ago where someone with the username Ledger tried to recruit Caden to judge Jackson's amends and vote on whether they were sufficient. Caden explains he declined because the whole thing felt creepy and manipulative, but now he realizes he was pulled into the scheme as an audience member. The messages show Ledger describing how Jackson needed to prove his redemption to a jury of peers and that where selected students would evaluate each task. Caden forwarded the recruiting message thinking it was spam, but now Rod screenshots everything for evidence. The cyber unit asks to see Caden's device, and he hands over his laptop so they can trace Ledger's account. They discover multiple students received similar recruitment messages, and at least 12 people accepted the invitation to become judges. Rod adds this information to his growing case file, while Chandler looks increasingly disturbed by how elaborate the manipulation scheme was. Chandler tries calling Jackson's parents again, and this time his mother answers on the 4th ring. We can hear her voice through the phone sounding confused and defensive when Chandler explains her son might be in danger. His mother insists Jackson has been fine lately, actually better behaved than usual, and asks why the school is calling with such dramatic claims. Chandler carefully explains the journal, the threats, the injuries, and the live stream without revealing too many details. Jackson's mother starts asking questions faster than Chandler can answer them, and her tone shifts from defensive to concerned. She admits she noticed Jackson seemed stressed but assumed it was normal teenage problems. Chandler asks if she's seen any injuries, and his mother hesitates before saying Jackson had some bruises, but he told her they were from basketball practice. The conversation continues for several minutes with Chandler trying to convey urgency without causing complete panic. His mother finally agrees to come to the school immediately and asks if Jackson is there now. No. Chandler has to admit we don't know exactly where he is, but we're working with police to locate him. Rod takes over the call with Jackson's mother, and his voice becomes more official as he explains the police involvement. He asks permission to send her photos from Jackson's journal showing documented injuries, and she agrees. Rod emails several pages including close-up pictures of bruises. Jackson photographed himself with dates and descriptions. We hear his mother gasp through the phone, and her voice cracks as she says she noticed those bruises, but Jackson insisted they were from basketball, and she believed him because he'd been acting so much better. Rod explains that sometimes abusers target people who are already struggling and manipulate them into compliance through threats and isolation. Jackson's mother starts crying and asking what she should have done differently. Rod redirects her by saying the most helpful thing now is to come to the police station immediately so they can coordinate a response. She agrees and says she'll be there in 15 minutes. Rod gives her the address and hangs up before turning to update everyone in the room. He explains that having a parent involved will help with any decisions about medical or psychiatric intervention once we locate Jackson. The computer screen refreshes, and Caden leans forward pointing at the live stream page where new text appears in red letters. Rod moves behind him to see the message that reads, 3 p.m. was mercy. Midnight is justice. He chose. Rod pulls out his phone and takes multiple screenshots of the page, including the timestamp and the message text, while the cyber unit officer sitting at the other computer starts running traces on the server hosting the stream. The officer explains that whoever set this up knows what they're doing, because the page routes through multiple proxy servers and uses encryption that will take time to crack. Rod adds the screenshots to his evidence file and forwards copies to the District Police Cybercrimes Division, asking for additional resources to identify the person controlling the page. Hallie stands up from her chair and addresses everyone in the room with her counselor voice that sounds calm but serious. She explains that research shows lethality risk actually increases after someone believes they've completed their final tasks because they feel like they've tied up loose ends and said their goodbyes. Jackson might think he's finished everything he needed to do, which means the midnight deadline could be a distraction from the real danger happening right now. She emphasizes that we're not just racing against a countdown timer, but against Jackson's mental state, where he's already made peace with dying and checked off his last items on the list. I look at Chandler and ask if I can record a voice message to send to Jackson, because maybe hearing from someone who was there on the roof will get through to him. Chandler glances at Rod, who considers it for a moment before nodding his approval. I pull out my phone and open the voice memo app with my hands shaking slightly as I press record. I say that I'm not asking him to be forgiven for anything he did before, and I'm not trying to judge whether his amends were good enough. I tell him I'm asking him to stay alive because people care what happens to him, and because dying doesn't actually fix anything, it just ends the possibility of things getting better. I keep the message under 30 seconds because Hallie advised me that shorter messages are more likely to be listened to completely. I save the recording and send it to Jackson's number, not knowing if he still has his phone on or if he'll even listen to it. 20 minutes pass with everyone in the office checking their phones constantly, and the cyber unit officer still working on tracing the live stream host. My phone finally pings with a notification, and I grab it so fast I almost drop it. The screen shows a location pin with coordinates pointing to a spot in the downtown Level 3 parking garage about 15 minutes from the school. A text message follows immediately after saying, "Don't bring cops," and Rod sees it over my shoulder before I can even process what it means. Rod tells me not to respond yet, while he pulls up a map of the parking garage on Chandler's computer and studies the layout of the different levels and exit points. Rod explains what he calls a soft intercept approach, where I would go into the garage with Kira as visible support, while plainclothes officers position themselves nearby but out of sight. Hallie would stay on text with me to provide prompts if Jackson starts talking about harming himself, and Rod would monitor everything from a vehicle with visual contact on the location. Kira agrees immediately when Rod asks if she's willing to go, saying that Jackson trusted her enough to give her the watch, so maybe he'll listen to her too. Rod makes several phone calls to coordinate with officers who can get to the parking garage quickly and who have training in crisis intervention situations. We arrive at the downtown parking garage at 1:30 in the morning, and the place feels empty, except for a few scattered cars that probably belong to people working late shifts at nearby businesses. The location pin leads us to the third level, where we park and walk carefully toward a corner spot near the exterior wall. Jackson sits on the concrete ledge with his back pressed against the wall and his knees pulled up to his chest. His phone glows in his hand, casting blue light on his face while Rod's voice comes through my earpiece confirming he has visual contact from his vehicle 2 levels down. Jackson looks worse than I've ever seen him, with his face swollen and puffy from hours of crying and his hands shaking so badly he can barely hold onto his phone. When he notices me and Kira walking toward him, he starts talking immediately, saying he just wanted to explain everything before it was too late. His voice sounds rough and broken, like he's been screaming or crying for so long that his throat hurts. He apologizes again for everything he did to everyone and says he tried to make it all right, but some things can't be fixed no matter how hard you try. I sit down on the concrete about 3 feet away from Jackson, keeping enough distance that he doesn't feel cornered, but close enough that he can hear me clearly. I tell him I'm not here to judge whether his amends were good enough or to decide if he deserves forgiveness for what he did before. Kira sits down next to me and adds that we're here because we don't want him to die, and that's completely separate from everything else that happened between him and the people he hurt. She says caring whether someone lives or dies doesn't require forgiving them first, and right now, we just need him to stay alive. Jackson's hands shake harder as he pulls up his phone and turns the screen toward us, showing a long thread of messages. The messages contain specific details about his younger sister's daily schedule, including what time she leaves for school, which route she walks, and which friends she meets on the corner. Photos attached to the messages show his sister at the school, at the park, and walking home, all taken from a distance like someone was following her without her knowing. Jackson explains in a whisper that someone called Ledger sent these messages starting about a month ago, saying that if he completed all 30 amends exactly as instructed, then he could choose how the final task happened. Ledger made it sound like Jackson would have control over the ending, instead of having something worse happen to his sister. My phone buzzes with a text from Hallie, asking me to relay a specific question to Jackson. I read her message and then asked Jackson what he thinks happens to his sister if he's not alive to protect her anymore. Jackson's expression shifts from that resigned look he had when we first sat down to something confused and uncertain. He admits he never actually thought about it that way, because Ledger made everything sound like his death would end the whole situation, and his sister would be safe once he finished. His hands stop shaking quite as much as he realizes that dying doesn't protect anyone, and might actually make things worse, because then there's no one watching out for threats against his family. Kira leans forward and says that if this Ledger person actually cared about making things right, or helping Jackson become better, he wouldn't be going after an innocent little kid who never did anything to anyone. Jackson's eyes shift from the edge of the parking level to Kira's face, and something changes in his expression, like he's seeing the situation from outside himself for the first time. She keeps going and points out that threatening his sister is just proof that Ledger wants control and power, not justice or redemption or any of the things he pretended this whole project was about. Jackson nods slowly, and his shoulders drop a little bit as the tension releases from his body. He whispers that he never thought about it that way, because Ledger made everything sound so reasonable at first, like Jackson deserved consequences, and this was his chance to fix what he broke. But threatening a 12-year-old girl who rides her bike to the school and plays soccer and never hurt anyone doesn't fit with the story Ledger told about accountability and growth. Jackson's phone buzzes in his hand, and he flinches so hard he almost drops it. He turns the screen toward us, and I can see a new message from Ledger with all capital letters demanding proof that Jackson is alone right now. The message says if police are involved, then his sister's home address gets posted publicly on every forum and social media site Ledger can access within the next 10 minutes. Jackson stands up fast and starts moving toward the edge of the parking level, saying he has to show he's following instructions, or his sister will be in danger. I can see his hands shaking worse than before as he holds his phone up like he's about to take a photo to prove he's alone. Kira scrambles to her feet, and I stand up too with my hands held out in front of me where Jackson can see them clearly. I tell Jackson that Ledger doesn't get to make these choices anymore, and that we can prove his sister is safe right now. I pull out my own phone and offer to call his sister on speakerphone so Jackson can hear her voice and know that she's okay at home with their parents. I explain that Ledger's threats are just manipulation tactics designed to keep Jackson scared and compliant, but we can break that control by proving the threats are empty. Jackson stops moving toward the edge and turns to look at me with tears streaming down his face. He says his sister should be home from soccer practice by now, and their mom always makes her do homework before dinner. My phone buzzes with a text from Rod saying they've spotted someone on the upper level of the parking garage with a laptop open. Rod's message says the person appears to be streaming or monitoring something, and plainclothes officers are moving quietly into position. I keep my face neutral and don't look up toward where Blair must be watching, because I don't want to spook either Jackson or the handler. I ask Jackson to tell me more about his sister's soccer team and what position she plays, keeping him talking while I watch his body language for any sign he might bolt. Jackson says she's a midfielder, and she's really good at stealing the ball from opponents because she's fast and reads the game well. He talks about going to her games last season before all this started and how proud he felt watching her play. I can see him relaxing slightly as he focuses on memories of his sister being safe and happy instead of the threats Ledger has been sending. Kira adds that she remembers seeing Jackson at those games because her little cousin plays on the same team. She says Jackson used to cheer really loud and bring orange slices for halftime snacks. Jackson's expression shifts again, and he looks confused like he forgot there was a version of himself that did normal brother things. I take a small step closer and ask Jackson to hand me his phone so I can be the one to finish the list by calling for help. I frame it as the final amendment being to accept support from people who want him alive. Jackson looks down at his phone, and then at the edge of the parking level, and then back at me. His hands are shaking, so badly I can hear the phone case rattling. He says Ledger will know if he gives up the phone and will follow through on the threats. I tell him that Ledger is going to be stopped in the next few minutes, and the only way to protect his sister is to let people help. Jackson takes 3 shaky breaths and finally extends his arm toward me, with the phone held loosely in his palm. I reach out slowly and take the phone from him, feeling how cold and sweaty his hand is when our fingers touch briefly. The moment the phone is in my hand, I hear shouting from the upper level and the sound of running footsteps. Rod's voice carries down through the parking structure, yelling for someone to stay on the ground. I look up and see 3 plainclothes officers surrounding a man in a dark jacket who's kneeling next to a laptop that's still open on the concrete. Rod appears at the railing above us and calls down that they have Nicodemus Blair in custody. He says the cyber unit is remotely accessing the laptop right now to freeze the countdown page. Jackson's whole body goes rigid, and he stares up at the upper level like he can't process what's happening. The pressure that's been driving him forward for 30 straight days just stops existing all at once. His knees buckle and he starts falling forward. I drop both phones and catch him before he hits the ground, but his weight pulls us both down until we're sitting on the cold concrete. Jackson sobs into my shoulder with these horrible gasping sounds like he can't get enough air. Kira pulls out her phone and calls for EMS, while Hallie's voice comes through on speakerphone from my dropped phone. Hallie starts coaching me through grounding techniques to keep Jackson present and calm. She tells me to get him to focus on physical sensations, like the feeling of concrete under us and the temperature of the air. I try to get Jackson to breathe with me, counting slowly to 4 on the inhale and 4 on the exhale. His sobbing gradually becomes more controlled, but he's still shaking all over. Kira kneels down next to us and puts her hand on Jackson's back, rubbing small circles while she keeps Hallie updated on his condition. Hallie says to keep him talking and aware of his surroundings so he doesn't dissociate from the trauma. I ask Jackson to name 5 things he can see right now. He chokes out words between sobs, naming the concrete, my jacket, Kira's shoes, the railing, and a crack in the floor. The paramedics arrive about 8 minutes later with their equipment bags and a stretcher. They kneel down and start checking Jackson's vital signs while Hallie continues providing crisis guidance through the phone. One paramedic wraps a blood pressure cuff around Jackson's arm, while another shines a light in his eyes to check his pupils. They ask him questions about whether he's hurt anywhere or if he took any substances. Jackson shakes his head and manages to say he's just tired, so tired he can't think straight anymore. The paramedics confer quietly and then tell us that Jackson is physically okay, but emotionally shattered. They recommend immediate evaluation at the hospital's psychiatric unit because of the suicide risk and the trauma he's been through. Jackson doesn't resist when they help him onto the stretcher and strap him in gently. Rod comes down from the upper level with Blair's laptop in an evidence bag and Jackson's phone that I dropped earlier. He's wearing gloves and handling everything carefully to maintain the chain of custody. Rod explains that they also recovered the router Blair was using for streaming, and that everything is being documented properly for the investigation. 2 uniformed officers escort Blair past us toward a police car, and I get a good look at him for the first time. He's maybe mid-20s with the kind of face that would blend into any crowd. He's not looking at Jackson or any of us, just staring straight ahead with no expression at all. Rod says Blair is being arrested on charges of coercion, extortion, and endangering the welfare of a minor. More charges will probably be added once the cyber unit finishes analyzing all the evidence. The ambulance takes Jackson to the hospital with lights on but no siren. Kira and I follow in her car because we want to be there when his parents arrive. The hospital's psychiatric unit is on the 4th floor, in a section that requires badge access to enter. We wait in a family room with uncomfortable chairs and old magazines, while nurses get Jackson settled in an evaluation room. His parents arrive about 30 minutes later, looking completely devastated and confused. Jackson's mother keeps asking what happened and why no one called her sooner. She says Jackson seemed fine this morning. Maybe a little quiet, but not like someone in crisis. His father stands by the window with his arms crossed, alternating between angry comments about Blair and guilty statements about missing the signs at home. He mentions noticing bruises, but Jackson always had an explanation that seemed reasonable at the time. A social worker comes out to talk with Jackson's parents and explain what happens next. The social worker brings Hallie into a private conference room where Jackson's parents are sitting with cups of coffee they're not drinking. Hallie pulls out a folder and starts going through what needs to happen immediately to keep Jackson safe. She explains that all medications need to be locked up, anything that could be used for self-harm needs to be removed from the house, and someone needs to be with Jackson at all times for the next several weeks. Jackson's father keeps nodding, but his mother starts crying again, asking if they really failed to notice things were this bad. Hallie tells them this isn't about blame right now, it's about creating a safety net moving forward. She schedules a psychiatric evaluation for tomorrow morning and explains that Jackson will likely need inpatient treatment for at least 2 weeks. When they bring Jackson into the room to discuss the plan, he looks so tired that he can barely keep his eyes open. Hallie asks if he understands what voluntary inpatient treatment means and if he's willing to go. Jackson just says he's too tired to fight anymore, that he wants help but doesn't know how to fix what's broken inside him. His mother reaches across the table to hold his hand, and he doesn't pull away, which seems like progress, even though everything else is terrible. Over the next few days, Rod works with the cyber unit to dig deeper into Blair's laptop and online activity. They find folders full of information about 3 other teenagers, all former bullies who were put through similar redemption projects over the past 2 years. Each kid has their own detailed file with lists of their victims, evidence of past bad behavior, and plans for 30-day transformation programs. The evidence shows Blair spent months researching each target before making contact, finding their weak points and gathering material to threaten them with. One kid was forced to volunteer at a homeless shelter every day for a month, while Blair threatened to release videos of him bullying a disabled student. Another girl had to tutor kids she used to mock while Blair held photos of her vandalizing school property over her head. The third target actually attempted suicide on day 28, when he couldn't complete all his assigned tasks, and Blair just moved on to Jackson without reporting what happened. Rod brings all this information to the district police chief and explains that Blair has been running this operation for 2 years, targeting kids he decided deserved punishment. The chief assigns additional detectives to interview all the victims and build a comprehensive case against Blair. Missy Chandler calls an emergency assembly 3 days after the parking garage incident. She stands at the podium in the auditorium looking tired but determined, and she doesn't waste time with small talk. She tells everyone that a student was recently in crisis and that adults intervened to keep him safe, but she doesn't name Jackson or give details that would identify him. Instead, she focuses on the resources available at the school, listing the counseling office hours, the crisis hotline number, and the anonymous reporting system for concerning behavior. She emphasizes that redemption doesn't come through coercion or punishment, that real change happens through support and accountability, not threats and fear. She makes it clear that seeking help is always the right choice, whether you're the person in crisis or someone who notices a friend struggling. The assembly lasts 20 minutes and feels more real than the usual don't do drugs speeches we get. Several students go to the counseling office right after to talk about things they've been keeping quiet, which Hallie later tells me is exactly what they hoped would happen. Caden spends the next week writing an article for the school paper about online coercion tactics and warning signs. He interviews Hallie about how to recognize when someone might be in crisis, focusing on changes in behavior, giving away possessions, and expressing finality about the future. He includes information about manipulation techniques that predators use online, like isolation, threats against loved ones, and creating artificial deadlines to increase panic. The article never mentions Jackson by name or gives details that would identify him, which I know took effort because Caden loves a good exclusive story. Instead, he makes the piece genuinely educational, something that could actually help other students recognize if they or someone they know is being coerced. Hallie reviews the article before publication to make sure it's accurate and helpful rather than sensational. When it runs in the school paper, several teachers ask for copies to use in their classes, and the principal emails it to all the parents in the district. The district attorney's office files charges against Blair 2 weeks after his arrest. The list includes coercion, extortion, stalking, cyberstalking, and endangering the welfare of multiple minors. The evidence is overwhelming with all the recorded streams Blair made, the messages he sent to his victims, and testimony from Jackson and the 3 other teenagers who were targeted. The DA tells Rod that they have enough to put Blair away for years, especially since one of his victims attempted suicide and another has documented PTSD from the experience. Blair's public defender tries to argue that he was just trying to teach bullies a lesson, that he was performing a public service by forcing them to make amends. The judge shuts that argument down immediately, pointing out that threatening children and coercing them towards self-harm isn't justice, it's another form of abuse. Blair's bail is set high enough that he can't pay it, so he stays in county jail while waiting for trial. Kira comes to find me in the library during study hall about a week after everything happened. She sits down across from me and says she's been thinking about Jackson and what comes next. She tells me she wants to participate in a restorative justice circle with him eventually, where they can talk about what he did to her and how it affected her. But she's not ready yet because she needs time to process everything that happened, both his original bullying and the coerced transformation she witnessed. She asks if I think that makes her a bad person, wanting to wait instead of immediately offering forgiveness. I tell her it doesn't make her bad at all, that she gets to decide her own timeline for healing. Later, I mention the conversation to Hallie, and she says Kira's approach is exactly right, that healing doesn't follow a set schedule, and healthy boundaries are important. She explains that restorative justice only works when both people are ready and rushing, it just creates more harm. 2 weeks after the parking garage incident, I drive to the psychiatric facility where Jackson is receiving treatment. The place looks more like a regular medical building than what I expected, with a nice lobby and plants in the windows. I have to check in at the front desk and wait while they call Jackson's unit to make sure he's allowed visitors. A nurse escorts me upstairs to a common room where Jackson is sitting by a window doing a puzzle. He looks better than the last time I saw him, less exhausted, though his hands still shake a little when he picks up puzzle pieces. His face isn't as pale and he's gained back some weight, which makes him look more like the Jackson from before everything started. We sit down at a table away from the other patients, and he thanks me for coming. He says the doctors are helping him understand the difference between guilt and shame, between making real amends and punishing himself. He's still dealing with trauma from Blair's coercion and guilt from his original bullying behavior, but now he has people helping him process it instead of just drowning in it alone. Jackson thanks me for not giving up on him that night in the parking garage, for calling for help instead of just walking away. But he doesn't ask me to forgive him for the bullying, which I actually respect more than if he had. We talk about how making amends is different from punishing yourself, how real change takes longer than 30 days, but also doesn't require dying to prove you're serious. He tells me about the therapy groups he attends here, where he's learning to sit with uncomfortable feelings instead of either lashing out or collapsing under them. He admits he doesn't know yet how to be a good person, that the 30 days taught him how to perform goodness, but not how to actually be different. I tell him that at least he knows the difference now, which is further than he was a month ago. We talk for about an hour before visiting time ends, and when I leave, he's back at his puzzle looking calmer than I've seen him in weeks. Hallie organizes support groups for students affected by everything that happened. She creates separate groups for students who were originally bullied by Jackson and students who were traumatized by witnessing his coerced transformation. She brings in specialists on online exploitation to help everyone process what they saw and experienced. The groups meet twice a week after school in different rooms, so people don't feel pressured to interact before they're ready. Some kids attend both groups because they were bullied by Jackson and then watched him fall apart, which created complicated feelings about both experiences. Hallie makes it clear that all feelings are valid, that you can be angry at someone for hurting you and still not want them to die. The specialists teach the group about manipulation tactics and how to recognize when someone online might be trying to coerce you into dangerous behavior. Several students share stories about weird messages they've received or online challenges they were invited to join, and the specialists help them understand the warning signs they missed. Rod presents to the school board about implementing digital safety curriculum and better monitoring of student well-being indicators. He brings data about how many teenagers are targeted by online predators each year and how many schools have no formal training on recognizing coercion patterns. He shows them examples of the messages Blair sent to Jackson and explains how easy it is for adults with bad intentions to manipulate vulnerable kids through social media and anonymous apps. The board members look uncomfortable during parts of the presentation, especially when Rod explains that Blair operated for 2 years without anyone noticing. Rod requests funding for additional counseling staff, training for teachers on recognizing signs of coercion, and a digital safety curriculum for all grade levels. The board votes to approve everything he asked for, allocating money from the emergency fund to hire 2 more counselors and bring in trainers for the staff. One board member says they should have had these systems in place years ago, that they got lucky Jackson survived, but the next kid might not. 3 months passed and Jackson came back to the school on a Tuesday morning with a backpack and a folder full of papers his therapist made him carry. He walked through the main entrance looking tired but steadier than before, no more shaking hands or checking over his shoulder every 5 seconds. Some kids moved aside to let him through the hallway, while others turned away completely, and both reactions seemed fair, given everything that happened. A freshman he used to tutor waved at him, and Jackson waved back but kept walking, not trying to force conversation or make people comfortable with his presence. Hallie stood near the counseling office watching him navigate the hallway, and when Jackson saw her, he stopped to check in like his safety plan required. She talked to him for maybe 2 minutes before he headed to first period, the whole interaction looking normal instead of desperate. At lunch, Jackson sat alone at a table near the windows, eating a sandwich and working on homework instead of making rounds to apologize or give things away. A few students from the support group sat at nearby tables, not with him, but not avoiding the whole area either, which felt like progress in a weird way. I passed him in the hallway between third and fourth period, and we made eye contact for half a second. He nodded once and I nodded back, neither of us stopping or trying to talk. He looked different now, less like someone performing goodness, and more like someone just trying to get through the day without falling apart. The change happening now was boring and slow, full of therapy appointments and safety check-ins instead of dramatic gestures. But watching him walk to class with his safety plan folder tucked under his arm felt more real than anything that happened during those 30 days. Because this time nobody was watching and nobody was counting down.